Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the course on chromatography. So, if you're taking this class, you're probably enrolled in the chemical technology program, and you could have experienced a course already on spectroscopy. However, this class is going to focus on completely different pieces of equipment. And the equipment that we're going to be talking about is chromatographs. So we need to talk about the theory of chromatography first before we turn you loose on the equipment and talk about the theory of how these pieces of instrumentation work. So we first need to talk about the discussion of what chromatography actually means. Okay, so if I ask you what does chromatography mean and you've never taken a chromatography class before, that's okay. We can kind of look at this word and we can break it up into two pieces. The first piece is chroma and the second piece is photography. Yeah, I had trouble saying that one. Can you say it? All right, so what we basically can say about chromatography, the word breakdown, is chroma means color. And then tography basically means write. So this literally translates to color writing, right? So back in the day when chromatography first came around, these people working in a laboratory basically took a look at this technique and they wanted to monitor the technique. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Well, to monitor is basically to look at. And the problem is that back in the day, unless things were colored, they were very difficult to see. We did not have the instrumentation that we have today in a laboratory, right? So we have to rely on our own eyeballs to take a look at the things that are happening in the laboratory. And one of the very first and the easiest mechanisms is to use your own eyes to look at color. Well, the thing here is that in today's environment, we no longer need color in order to perform chromatography. So we need to talk about the different variations of chromatography. What can we see? What can we expect? But I want you to keep in mind that no longer do things have to be colored in order to be analyzed in the chromatography world. All right, so this is not our definition that we would use today. Color writing is not acceptable anymore. So the definition that we can now use is basically a process in which components of a mixture can be separated. All right, so basically what that means is that I have a sample that's been given to me in a lab. And that sample is probably made up of more than one thing, right? So I've got these blue dots that represent one component. I've got these red dots that represent a second component. I can have upwards of 50 and 60 components if I want to analyze those types of samples in a chromatography lab. But we'll keep it simple for now. So I get this sample that's been brought into the lab, and this sample needs to be separated because we want to know what is inside of that sample. So chromatography will take this sample and it will basically cluster all of my red components together, and it will cluster all of my blue components together, and it will separate them, and it will send them through the instrument to be seen by the detector. Okay, so overall, that's basically what chromatography basically is now. It is just a way for me to take a very complicated sample in a laboratory and for me to separate it into the individual components that make it up. And then the machine is going to tell me how much. It's going to tell me how much of the red component, how much of the blue component, but keep in mind, it's not just colors here. we can actually detect things that are not colored anymore. So this is great. Chromatography really does wonders with a sample or a mixture. And this is where the power of chromatography really steps into play. Now, chromatography just does the separation. That's all that it does, right? It doesn't do anything else but separate the components from each other. Chromatography is typically paired up, and it's paired up with a partner in crime, and that pairing is with a spectrometer most of the time. Okay? So if you've taken the spectroscopy class, and you've already familiar with UV vis or infrared or atomic absorption or mass spectroscopy, if you're familiar with those techniques, the good news for you is that those spectrometers are used on the chromatography instruments in order to see and measure the stuff. So the spectrometer actually sees the stuff that comes off, and it actually measures, it quantifies for us. The chromatographer instrument or chromatograph instrument is just separating the mixture. That's all that it will do. So when I say the separation, you need to think of chromatography as just a more fancier form of something like distillation, because that separated components into the individual mixtures, right? You can talk about many other processes, such as the oxalate extraction. That separates things from each other. But that's all that the chromatography instruments are. They separate. They do not see the component. They do not measure the component. The only thing that the actual chromatograph does is separate. It's the spectrometers that maybe we've learned about in another class that actually see the components and measure the components for us. But the chromatography instrument itself at its heart just separates, and that's all that it does. Okay? Something else that I need to say about chromatography is that chromatography now is really one of the most widely used pieces of equipment in a laboratory in today's environment. So there's different types of chromatography instruments out there. We will make our way through each and different types of one of them, but keep in mind that chromatography is actually more common in a way than just simple spectrometers are. So if you're working in a laboratory, or if you're going to be doing an interview for a laboratory, they're probably going to ask you your knowledge or your working ability with some type of chromatography instrument. And you need to pay attention to all of the lecture topics that we're getting ready to discuss, because this could be a powerhouse for you in a job interview and land you that very first job maybe in a laboratory, because they're going to be very impressed with your knowledge that you have. Okay, so that's kind of the intro to chromatography. We'll come back in the next video and we'll talk about the history of chromatography. Can we label a father to the chromatography world? And you're going to quickly see that yes, we can kind of give one man the credit, and maybe the credit that he deserves, to kind of start this whole chromatography theory that we're learning today. So stay tuned. Don't go too far. You might as well watch this second video on chromatography. I know you probably don't have anything else to do. So come back, join me again, and we'll talk a little bit of history lesson when it concerns chromatography.